The storm had turned the gas station lot into a sheet of black glass, and the man slumped against the ice machine was not moving the way a sleeping man moves. Nora Vance saw him through the diner window at the end of her shift, a heavy shape in soaked leather with his head tipped back against the cinder block, rain hammering off the brim of nothing. No shelter over him at all. The other waitresses had already gone. The cook had locked the kitchen and driven off into the dark. She was 19 years old, 90 pounds of nothing in a thrift store rain jacket, and every instinct she had been taught said, "Walk to your car, lock the doors, do not look at the big frightening man in the corner of the lot." She looked anyway. His chest rose. It fell. The breath caught between, hitched like a door swollen in its frame. She had one umbrella. It was cheap and bent, and the third rib had snapped 2 winters ago. She crossed the lot. That was the whole of it, in the beginning. A girl, and a broken umbrella, and a man she had never seen, in a town that had taught her nobody was coming to help anybody. She did not know yet that the small thing she did under that black sky would bring the rest of them to her door. She did not know that 3 days later the windows of her grandmother's house would shudder with the sound of engines, or that the man she sheltered wore a name on his back that made grown men step off sidewalks. She only knew that he was cold, and that she had an umbrella, and that some things you do not get to think about first. Let the rain fall back 4 hours to where the trouble in Nora's life actually lived. The town was called Holler Creek, a tired ribbon of asphalt strung between an interstate exit and a dry river, the kind of place that had been on its way to somewhere better for 40 years and never arrived. Nora had grown up in her grandmother's narrow house on Beaumont Street, raised by a woman whose hands had gone to knots, and whose breath came short now after the smallest stairs. Her parents were a closed subject. Her grandmother, Ruth, was the only family the word still meant anything for. And the house on Beaumont, the house with the sagging porch and the lemon tree that refused to die, was the only thing either of them owned outright in the world. Except they did not own it outright anymore. Not the way Nora had believed. She had learned this 6 days before the storm in the office of a man named Garrett Pruitt. Pruitt held the second mortgage Ruth had signed without telling anyone 3 years back, when the roof failed and the contractor wanted cash and the bank had laughed her out of the lobby. Pruitt did not laugh. Pruitt wore pressed slacks and a watch that cost more than the roof, and he ran a lending operation out of a glass-fronted suite on the good end of town, the end with the new sidewalk and the planted trees. He had handed Ruth the money and a stack of paper, and Ruth, 68 and frightened and proud, had signed where the small, clean finger pointed. The number on the paper was $11,000. The number Pruitt now said was owed was 31. And, whilst Nora had sat across his wide, clean desk and watched him explain it, the way the interest stacked, the way a missed payment triggered a penalty, and the penalty triggered a rate, and the rate ate the rest. He explained it kindly. That was the part that stayed with her, lodged like a splinter. He smiled the entire time, a smile that never once reached the cold blue of his eyes, and he told her that he understood, he truly did. These things were hard, but the home would have to be sold at the end of the month, and there was simply nothing to be done. He said it the way a man tells you about the weather. He had the deed of trust. He had the law. He made very clear, without ever raising his voice, every official thing on his side, and she had nothing but a number she could not pay, and a grandmother who did not yet know. You could fight it, he had said, leaning back, lacing his manicured fingers. People do. They hire a lawyer they cannot afford, and they delay a thing that cannot be stopped. I would not advise it. I would advise you to make your grandmother comfortable with the idea. Then he had checked his expensive watch, as if her family were an appointment running long. She had walked out into the heat with the splinter, working deeper. She did not cry in the lobby. She did not cry in the car. And she drove to the diner and tied on her apron and carried plates for 8 hours because the $40 in tips was $40 they did not have. And the thing about being poor that nobody who is not poor understands is that there is no time to fall apart. The shift ends. The next one comes. You keep your feet. That was the life behind the girl in the window. That was what she carried across the black glass of the lot. To the man against the ice machine, he was enormous. She saw that the moment she got close, the way his shoulders filled the leather, the way his hands, even slack, were the size of stones. His beard was iron gray and rain-flattened against a face carved deep by weather and years. He had to be 60. On the back of his vest, soaked near black, she could make out the curve of an embroidered patch, a snarling skull over crossed pistons, and an arc of letters above it she could not read in the dark and would not have known if she could. She knew only the shape of the thing. She knew it was the kind of vest that meant a man other men feared. And she knelt down in the freezing water beside him anyway and held her broken umbrella over his head and said, Hey, mister, can you hear me?" His eyes opened. They were gray as the beard, and for a moment they did not focus, and his breath hitched again in that swollen doorway, and a hand the size of a stone closed weakly around her wrist. "Bike went down," he said. The voice came up out of him like gravel rolling in a barrel. "Half-mile back, walked here. Heart's doing something." "You're having a heart attack," Nora said, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her. Her grandmother had survived, too. Nora knew the gray, the sweat that was not from heat, the way the chest worked like it had forgotten the job. "Not yet," he rumbled and almost smiled. Bad enough. She did not have a phone with charge. She would learn to hate that fact for the rest of her life. The dead phone in her pocket. The gas station's old pay phone still hung on the wall, a relic nobody had torn down, and she ran to it through the rain with the broken umbrella forgotten on the asphalt, and fed it the only quarters she had and called for an ambulance to a town that had one. Then she went back and she sat down in the flooding lot, and she held the umbrella over the big stranger's head, the broken rib of it folding under the wind, and she kept him talking. She told him about the lemon tree that would not die. She told him about Ruth and the 2 heart attacks and the cinnamon rolls Ruth still made when her hands allowed. She did not tell him about Pruitt or the 31,000 or the end of the month, because that splinter was hers and it had no place here. She just talked, and the rain came down, and 22 minutes later the ambulance found them, a girl and a giant under a folding umbrella. And the medics did the things medics do, and as they loaded him onto the gurney, he caught her wrist one more time. "Your name," he said. "Nora Wendell," he said. "Nora, I won't forget this." She thought it was the thing a person says. She watched the ambulance pull away with its lights swimming in the rain, and she picked up a ruined umbrella and she drove home to a house she was about to lose, and she put the whole strange night into the same locked drawer where she kept everything she could not afford to feel. She did not expect to ever see the big man named Wendell again. She had no idea what she had set in motion. The next morning she did not tell Ruth. She made the coffee, and she watched her grandmother's slow hands wrap around the warm cup, and she looked at the kitchen. Ruth had stood in for 40 years, the burn mark on the counter from a Christmas long ago, the window over the sink that framed the lemon tree, and she could not make her mouth form the words, "The home would have to be sold." Instead, she said she was picking up a double. Instead, she drove back to the diner and carried plates. Pruitt came in at noon. He had never come into the diner before. It was not his end of town. He sat in her section in his pressed slacks, and he ordered black coffee he did not drink, and he watched her work with that smile that did not reach the cold blue of his eyes. When she set the cup down, he put 2 fingers on the saucer, so she could not take her hand back without making a scene. "I wanted to be sure you understood," he said quietly, pleasantly, "that the timeline is firm. The auction is the 1st of the month. I have a buyer already, a developer. The whole row on Beaumont, actually. They want to clear it for those new townhomes." He said it like good news. "Or for your grandmother to do something dramatic when the papers are served. Old people, sometimes, the stress." He let that hang. He did not finish the sentence, but the thing underneath it sat there at the table between them, ugly and unhurried, and he sipped the coffee at last, and stood and left $3 that he placed with great care, as if even his tip were a thing he was teaching her. Nora stood very still after the door closed. The bell over it was still swinging. The $3 sat in their neat fan on the white saucer, and she looked at them a long moment before she swept them into her apron pocket, because $3 was $3. And pride did not buy a roof. The other customers had heard none of it. A trucker in the corner booth wanted his check. A woman by the window wanted more coffee. The shift did not stop for the end of the world, and Nora carried the pot to the window and poured and said the small things a waitress says, and her hands did not shake because she had learned a long time ago how to keep her hands still when it mattered most. The splinter had become a blade. She felt it turn every time the 2 fingers on the saucer came back to her, the small, clean nails, the patient way he had pinned her hand so she would have to stand and hear him out. She thought that night, lying awake in the narrow room she had slept in since she was 6, there is no one coming. The bank would not, the town would not. The law was a thing that lived in Pruitt's pressed pocket. She was 19, and she had $40 in tips, and a grandmother with a bad heart and a lemon tree. And against her stood money and connection, and the patient machinery of paper. And the machinery always won. Everyone knew the machinery always won. That was the whole education of a place like Holler Creek. She fell asleep believing it. Sunday came gray and washed clean. The storm long passed, the streets steaming as the sun came up. Ruth was in the kitchen by 8, her hands good that morning, working dough for the cinnamon rolls she made when the mood took her, and the small house filled with cinnamon and butter, and the particular piece of a thing being made by hands that love you. Nora sat at the table and drank coffee, and for 1 hour, one ordinary hour, she let herself pretend that nothing was ending. Then she heard the engines. It started as a sound at the edge of town, a low, rolling thunder that did not belong to the morning. And it grew, and it deepened, and the cups in the cupboard began to tick against each other, and Ruth stopped with flour on her hands and said, "What in the world?" Nora went to the front window. Down Beaumont Street, turning off the dead highway, and coming on slow and disciplined and absolutely certain, rode a column of motorcycles. Not a knot of them. With a Gintis, a column, 2 by 2, chrome catching the new sun, more than she could count at a glance, the sound of them filling the whole street and rattling the glass in its frame. Neighbors came out onto their porches. The column did not slow for them. It came straight down Beaumont, and it stopped, engine by engine, in a long, gleaming row directly in front of the narrow house with the sagging porch and the lemon tree. The silence after the engine's cut was its own kind of loud. A big man swung off the lead bike. He was younger than Wendell, broad as a doorway, his head shaved, a scar through one eyebrow, and across the back of his vest the same snarling skull over crossed pistons that Nora had seen soaked black in the rain. Below it, a curved patch read Sarniant at Arms. He did not look at the gawking neighbors. He walked up the cracked path to the porch, and he stopped at the bottom step, and he looked at Nora through the screen door, with eyes that gave away nothing. "You, Nora," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes? Wendell sent us." He paused. "He's alive. They put 2 stents in him, Thursday ornery, as a busted muffler. He'd have come himself. Doc's got him strapped to a bed in the city, and he is not happy about it." Something that was almost but not quite. A smile moved under the scar. "He told us about the umbrella." Nora's hand was shaking on the screen door latch. Behind her, Ruth had come into the front room, flowers still on her hands, staring out at the impossible row of chrome and leather filling her street. "I don't." Nora started, and stopped, and started again. "I don't understand." "I just held an umbrella anyone would have." "No," the big man said simply. "They wouldn't. They didn't. There were 3 cars in that lot when he went down, and they all drove off, and the cameras at that station work fine, and we watched the footage." His jaw set. "You were the only one who stopped. You knelt down in a flood next to a man you had every reason to be scared of, and you got him breathing, and you stayed. Wendell has rode 40 years. He has pulled more men out of more ditches than this town has people. Nobody ever once did the same for him until a 90-pound girl with a broke umbrella. He let that sit. We pay our debts. That's the only law we've got that's worth a damn. So here we are." He told them his name was Cole. He told them the club had a charter 2 counties over, and a clubhouse that was nobody's business, and a code that was very much their business, and that the code said, plain and old and unbendable, that a life saved was a debt owed by every man wearing the patch, not just the one who was saved. He said Wendell had given exactly one instruction from his hospital bed, and the instruction was, find the girl and find out what's wrong, because something is wrong. A girl that's scared and that kind does not get scared of nothing. And that was the moment Nora's careful locked drawer came open. She had meant to keep the splinter to herself. She had meant to handle it alone, the way she handled everything, with her feet under her and her face still. Now Ruth was standing there with flour on her hands in the last Sunday she would ever bake in that kitchen, and the engines had rattled something loose. And before Nora could stop it, the whole of it came out on the porch in the morning light. The second mortgage, the 11,000 that became 31, Pruitt and his pressed slacks, and his watch, and his smile that never reached his eyes, the diner, the 2 fingers on the saucer, the developer, the auction, the first of the month. The thing he had said about old people, and stress that he had not finished saying, Cole listened without moving. The other riders had drifted up from the row of bikes and stood in a loose half-circle on the dead grass, leather and gray beards and ink and stillness, and not one of them said a word. And the longer Nora talked, the more the silence among them changed its temperature. When she got to the part about the two fingers on the saucer, a low sound moved through the half-circle. Not a word, just a shift. The sound a thing makes when it decides. Garrett Pruitt, Cole said when she had finished. He said the name the way a man reads a license plate he intends to remember. You can't, Nora said quickly. The old fear came up fast. Whatever you're thinking, he has lawyers. He has the deed. He has the law. He said so. He has everything official on his side. If anything happens to him, they'll know it was. They'll trace it to. You'll all be. She could not finish either. She had caught the disease of unfinished sentences from a man in pressed slacks. For the first time, the thing under Cole's scar became a real smile, and it was not a warm smile, and it was not a cruel one. It was the smile of a man who has been underestimated his whole life by exactly the kind of person who underestimates everybody. "Ma'am," he said to Nora, who had never been called ma'am in her life, "we are not going to lay a finger on Pruitt." He looked back over his shoulder at the row of chrome, and then up at the porch, at the lemon tree, at Ruth, with the flower on her hands. "We're going to do something a whole lot worse than that. We're going to follow the rules." Nora did not understand him yet. She would. The bikes did not leave. That was the first thing the street learned that Sunday, that the long, gleaming row in front of the Vance house was not passing through. 3 of the older riders walked the perimeter of the property slow and easy, the way men walk who are memorizing a thing, and a wiry younger one with a laptop bag slung across his chest asked Nora, polite as a banker, whether her grandmother happened to have kept the paperwork. The original paperwork. Everything Pruitt had ever handed her. Every statement. Every notice. The whole stack. Ruth had kept all of it. Ruth had kept every piece of paper that had ever come into that house since 1971 in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed, and Nora hauled it out into the front room, and the wiry rider, whose road name turned out to be Ledger because he was the one who read the fine print, spread it across the kitchen table next to the cooling cinnamon rolls, and began to read. He read for 2 hours. He did not eat the roll Ruth set beside him, though he thanked her for it twice, with a shy courtesy that did not match the patch on his back. He read with a pen in his hand and made small marks, and the longer he read, the quieter and more focused he became, and twice he made a low sound in his throat, and once he set the pen down entirely and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a full minute before he picked it up again. "Found it," he said at last. What Ledger had found was not magic. It was not a trick. It was, he explained, laying it out for Nora and Ruth and Cole at the kitchen table, with the patience of a man who genuinely wanted them to understand the simple fact that Pruitt had broken the law. Several laws. The kind written down in statute books with numbers, the kind that came with their own penalties, the kind that a man who lives by the deed and the paper and the rule somehow never imagines will be turned around and read back to him. The interest rate on the second mortgage was usurious, past the legal ceiling for the state, and by a wide margin. That alone, Ledger said, could void the whole instrument. There was more. The original disclosure documents, the ones a lender was required by law to provide before a borrower signed, were missing key pages, and the pages that were present had been altered after signing. The rate in one place not matching the rate in another, a date written over. There was a forbearance Ruth had been verbally promised and never given in writing. There was a notice of default that had been backdated. There was a pattern, Ledger said, tapping the stack, a clear, documented pattern, and the beautiful thing, the thing that made him almost smile, was that Pruitt had created every page of it himself. He had been so certain, no one would ever look. He had built his whole confident machine on the certainty that people like Ruth Vance never had the money to hire someone to look. He's been doing it for years, Ledger said quietly. This is not his first house. Look at the construction of it. This is a man with a process, which means there are others. He squared the papers, and it means there is a state agency whose entire job is exactly this, and a thing called the Statute of Limitations that is not run, and a thing called treble damages, and a thing called a license that can be pulled. He looked up at Nora. Your friend in the pressed slacks told you he had everything official on his side. He was lying. The official thing was always sitting in your grandmother's cedar chest. He just bet his whole life that you'd never open it. Nora sat very still. The blade in her chest had begun very slowly to turn into something else. But we can't afford a lawyer, she said. That's the whole. That's exactly we can't pay anyone. Cole leaned forward. Wendell's nephew is a lawyer, he said. Consumer protection. Up in the city. Hates men like Pruitt the way a dog hates a tick. He's already got the file. He took it Friday, the day after the stents. Soon as Wendell could talk, the almost smile again. You didn't think we showed up on a Sunday with a column of bikes and no plan, did you? The bikes are for the neighbors. And for Pruitt, when he hears the lawyer is for the law. That was the thing Nora had not understood on the porch, and understood now. They had not come to break anything. They had come to make the machinery, the patient grinding machinery. That everyone in Holler Creek knew always won, turn the other way for once. They had come with the one thing Pruitt had counted on the poor never having. They had the resources to read the fine print, and the will to follow it all the way down. Pruitt heard about the bikes within the hour. Of course, he did. A column of leather and chrome parked all day in front of a house on Beaumont was the only thing anyone in Holler Creek talked about that Sunday, and by afternoon the talk had reached the good end of town with the new sidewalk and the planted trees. What Pruitt did with the information told Nora everything about the kind of man he was. He called the police. He did not call to report a crime because no crime had been committed. The bikes were parked legally on a public street. The men were doing nothing but standing on a dying lawn, drinking coffee Ruth kept making and being, by every visible measure, the most polite collection of frightening men the street had ever seen. Pruitt called, because Pruitt's entire understanding of the world was that official force was his to summon, a thing he owned, a dog he could whistle, and he wanted it pointed at the people on Beaumont Street. A single cruiser came. One officer, a tired man near retirement, named Deputy Hassel, who had grown up in Holler Creek and knew exactly which end of town buttered which bread. He got out slow. He looked at the bikes. He looked at the house. He looked at Cole, who walked down to meet him, with his hands loose and visible and his manner mild, and the two big men stood in the street and talked low for a few minutes while the whole block watched from behind curtains. Whatever Cole said, it was not a threat, because Cole did not deal in threats. What Cole had was a folder. Ledger had made a copy. Cole handed it to the deputy and said, mild as milk, that the men were just visiting a friend, that they'd be no trouble, and that since the deputy was here anyway, he might find the contents of the folder worth a look, on account of it documented a fair amount of crime and not the kind the men on the lawn had committed. Deputy Hassel read in his cruiser for 20 minutes with the door open and one boot on the asphalt. When he got out, he did not move the bikes. He walked up to the porch, and he took his hat off to Ruth, which he had not done for a citizen in some years, and he said, Mrs. Vance, I think you're going to be all right. Then he drove back to the good end of town. And he did not go to Pruitt's glass-fronted suite to remove anyone's enemies. He went, Nora would later learn, to make a phone call of his own, to a man he knew at the State Lending Commission because Deputy Hassel had buttered Pruitt's bread for a long time and had grown very tired of the taste. The machinery had begun at last to turn. It did not turn all at once, and it did not turn with engines and chrome. It turned with paper, the same patient paper Pruitt had wielded, except now the paper was pointed the other way and it was being pushed by a consumer protection lawyer in the city who hated ticks, and by a state commission that had received the same documented pattern from two directions, and by a tired deputy who had decided which end of town he was on after all. Wendell's nephew filed Monday. The filing froze the auction. The first of the month came and went, and there was no auction, because you cannot sell a house out from under a defaulted note when the note itself is the subject of a formal complaint alleging the lender committed fraud in its creation. Pruitt fought the way men like Pruitt fight. He hired his own lawyers, the expensive kind, the kind he had always assumed only his kind could afford. His lawyers, reading the file, kept arriving at the same wall Ledger had found at the kitchen table. Their client had written every incriminating page himself. There is no defense a lawyer can mount against a man's own forgeries. There is no spin for an altered rate, and a backdated default, and a verbal forbearance broken in writing. The expensive lawyers began to bill enormous hours, arriving at the same conclusion. The wiry writer had reached over a cooling cinnamon roll, and Pruitt began, slowly, to understand the shape of the thing closing around him. The day it broke open was a Thursday, 3 weeks after the storm. Wendell was out of the hospital by then, moving slow, forbidden to ride, driven everywhere by a younger member in a way that Nora gathered was a deep humiliation he bore with the dignity of a man who had pulled too many others out of ditches to complain about being driven for a while. He had come to the house on Beaumont twice. The first time he had sat on the sagging porch in the sun and Ruth had brought him cinnamon rolls, and he had eaten 3 and pronounced them the best thing he had put in his mouth in a decade, and he had not talked about the umbrella or the debt or any of it. He had talked about the lemon tree and about Holler Creek and about a daughter he did not see, and the 2 old people and the girl had sat on the porch, and the afternoon had passed easy. That was when Nora understood the thing the style of the patch had hidden from her. The warmth was real. It just did not arrive through words. It arrived through showing up and through paper, read line by line, and through 3 cinnamon rolls eaten slow on a sagging porch. The second time he came, on the Thursday, he came to tell them it was over. The State Lending Commission had pulled Pruitt's license. The consumer protection suit, joined now by 2 other families whose houses Ledger's pattern had predicted exactly, had produced a settlement that the expensive lawyers had begged Pruitt to take, because the alternative was a courtroom and a jury, and the man's own forged pages read aloud one by one. The Vance note was void, not reduced, not refinanced. Void, dissolved, gone. The 11,000 that became 31 collapsed into nothing, because the instrument that created it had been built on fraud, and the law that Pruitt had worshipped his whole life turned out to have teeth after all when somebody finally bothered to point them. The developer who wanted the whole row on Beaumont for townhomes had pulled out the week before when the first reporter called. The house was Ruth's, clear and clean and outright in a way it had not been since 1971. And Pruitt was finished, not hurt, not touched. No man wearing the snarling skull over crossed pistons had ever laid a hand on him, and that was the part Nora came to treasure most, because it meant the thing that destroyed him was entirely his own. his license. His suit stayed pressed, but there was nothing to wear them to. The good end of town, the end with the new sidewalk, has no patience for a man whose name is in the paper next to the word fraud, and Haller Creek discovered overnight that it had never really liked Pruitt, the way a town discovers it never liked a man the moment it becomes safe to say so. He put the glass-fronted suite up for lease. He was seen once loading boxes into a clean, expensive car, the flat, hard light of a Tuesday noon, squinting into a sun that gave him no shadow to stand in. And then he was not seen in Haller Creek again. Wendell told them all of it on the porch, slow in the gravel barrel voice, and when he finished, Ruth cried, "The quiet kind, the kind that has been held too long." And Wendell let her, and did not say a word, because there was nothing a word could do that his showing up had not already done. Then he turned to Nora. "You want to know why?" he said. It was not quite a question either. They ran in the family of that club, the sentences that were not quite questions. "You said you'd pay a debt," Nora said. "And you paid it 10 times over. The lawyer was never going to be free. I know what those things cost you." The lawyer was Wendell's nephew. He'd have done it for a phone call. He shifted on the porch step, one big hand flat on his knee. "I don't mean the house. I mean why. Why a man rides 40 years and pulls people out of ditches and tells himself that's the whole of it, the riding and the pulling, and then one night his own heart quits in a flooded lot and 3 cars drive off, and the only soul that stops is a girl who's got every reason in the world to run, and who is at that exact minute being robbed blind by a man in pressed slacks. And she has not got a thing left to give anybody, and she crosses the lot anyway with a broke umbrella." He looked out at the lemon tree. "I rode 40 years thinking I was the one who stopped for people. Turns out I had it backwards. Turns out I'd been waiting my whole life to find out if anybody would stop for me." The gray eyes came back to her. "You did? So now you're ours. That's how it works. You don't get a vote." Nora did not know what to say, so she said the truest thing she had. "I only had the one umbrella." "I know," Wendell said. "It was broke, too." And the old man laughed, first full laugh she had heard out of him, a sound like a barrel rolling downhill, and Ruth laughed through her tears, and out on the street one of the riders polishing chrome looked up and grinned, and the splinter that had lived in Nora's chest since the office with the wide, clean desk was gone, entirely gone, and in its place was something she did not have a word for yet, but would spend years learning the size of. They did not adopt her with a ceremony. There was no patch, no oath, nothing so neat. What happened instead was that the bikes started coming around. Not in a column, not to rattle the windows, just 2 or 3 at a time on a Sunday. A rider stopping by to fix the porch rail that had sagged for a decade. Another to look at Ruth's roof, the one that started the whole disaster, and patch it right this time so it would never fail again. Ledger came once a month and went over every piece of paper that entered the house, and taught Nora how to read the fine print herself, how to find the altered date and the rate that did not match, so that no man in pressed slacks would ever again build a machine around the certainty that she would not look. Cole taught her to change her own oil. In the driveway on a Saturday, the wiry younger ones heckling them both. And Wendell, who was not allowed to ride yet and might never be again, came and sat on the porch and ate cinnamon rolls and talked to Ruth about everything and nothing, 2 old people who had each, late in life, been surprised by the world. Haller Creek talked, of course. A town like that always talks. The talk had changed its flavor, though it was no longer the talk of a place that knew the machinery always won. It had seen, with its own eyes, from behind its own curtains, the machinery turn the other way. And it had learned the thing that Nora learned, kneeling in the flood, the thing the club had known for 40 years and the good end of town had forgotten, that the law on the paper and the justice in the world are two different animals, and that sometimes the only way to make them lie down together is for somebody nobody is afraid of to do one small brave thing for somebody nobody is watching. The lemon tree, that spring, did a thing it had not done in years. It fruited, heavy and yellow and ridiculous, more lemons than two old women and a girl and an occasional clubhouse full of bikers could ever use, and Ruth made lemon bars until the whole street smelled of them and gave them away over the fence to neighbors who had stood on their porches that first Sunday. On a Sunday near the end of that spring, Nora stood at the kitchen window with her hands in dishwater, looking out at the lemon tree and the patched roof, and the fixed porch rail and the two motorcycles in the drive and the big gray-bearded man asleep in a chair in the sun with a paper plate of lemon bars balanced on his chest. Ruth was humming. The water was warm on Nora's hands. Somewhere down Beaumont a single engine started and idled and settled, a sound she had once feared and now knew the way. You know the breathing of someone you love in the next room. She had given a stranger a broken umbrella in a storm, expecting nothing because some things you do not get to think about first. And the whole world she had been taught did not exist had ridden down a dead highway on a Sunday morning and parked itself in front of her door and stayed and called her one of its own. She dried a plate. She set it on the rack. The engine down the street went quiet, and the sun came through the window over the sink, and it smelled like lemons, and it smelled, for the first time in her whole hard life, like belonging. If this story warmed something in you, if you have ever been the one who stopped when it would have been easier to drive on, or ever prayed that somebody would stop for you, stay a moment and let that feeling settle. Leave a word below for the people in your life who showed up when no one was watching. And if stories of loyalty and quiet courage are what bring you here, walk with us a while longer. There are more of them coming.